Once upon a time in a small village in the southeastern part of Nigeria, surrounded by green hills and farms, there lived a beautiful princess named Adaugo. Her father, King Ezeku, ruled over the happy village with wisdom and strength. Queen Purima, her mother, was admired for her grace and kindness. Princess Adaugo was the king's eldest daughter, known for her gentle heart and kindness toward the villagers. However, Adaugo had a difficult issue that had troubled her since birth. She had a very strong body odor that smelled quite bad. Even as a young girl, Adaugo's scent was much worse than the other children's, and as she grew, it became even more unbearable. A pungent, unpleasant smell trailed behind her wherever she walked. As Adaugo matured into a young woman, the people of the village began treating her differently. They tried to stay away from her because of her overpowering odor. Behind her back, some villagers made unkind jokes and whispered about how stinky the princess was. Mothers quickly pulled their children inside when they saw Adaugo walking down the dusty village road. The young girls who were once her friends would turn and go the opposite direction to avoid talking with her. This broke Adaugo's heart. There were many young men in the village and neighboring kingdoms who wished to court Adaugo because of her beauty and royal status. But as soon as they got within 6 feet of her, they were driven away by the strong, unbearable smell. Despite Adaugo's beauty and noble blood, they refused to pursue her. This left the princess feeling deeply lonely. She stopped leaving the palace, spending most of her days locked in her bedroom. She would sit by the window, gazing at the world outside, dreaming of love. Adaugo imagined a husband who would love her for her kind heart, someone who wouldn't care about her odor. But that dream seemed impossible. She cried many nights, feeling completely alone. One hot summer day, the village was alive with joyous drum beats and laughter. It was the summer feast day, a celebration filled with dancing and music. From her palace bedroom, Princess Adaugo sat fanning herself, the shutters wide open, hoping to catch a breeze. She heard lively sounds floating up from the village square, the rhythmic beating of drums, people clapping and singing. Curiosity stirred in Adaugo's heart. She leaned out her window and saw the villagers dancing around a great bonfire, their colorful skirts swirling as they laughed and spun around. She longed to join them. For the first time in a long while, she thought maybe she could sneak out and watch from a distance. The people seemed so happy and distracted by the celebrations. Maybe they wouldn't notice her. With this thought, Adaugo wrapped her face with a shawl and quietly left the palace. She tiptoed through the dark streets, keeping to the shadows, until she reached the edge of the village square. For a few moments, no one noticed her. Adaugo stood in the shadows, watching wistfully as girls her age spun in their bright skirts, moving in perfect rhythm with the music. Then, a breeze blew through the square. It carried Adaugo's odor with it. People wrinkled their noses, glancing around, searching for the source of the terrible stench. Then, one by one, all eyes turned to Adaugo. The drums stopped. The dancing ceased. A stunned silence fell over the square. Mouths fell open in shock, then twisted into disgusted sneers. People gagged, whispered behind their hands, and pointed at her. The joy and laughter that had filled the air just moments before vanished. Humiliation burned in Adaugo's chest. Her eyes filled with tears. Before anyone could say another word, Adaugo turned and ran. She fled from the square, her heart pounding in shame, tears streaming down her face. She ran and ran until she reached a dense bushy area outside the village. She collapsed behind a tree, trembling, trying to catch her breath. She crouched, hiding, praying no one would find her. But then she heard something. A steady beat of a drum, growing louder and closer. Adaugo's breath hitched in fear. She peered through the leaves to see who was approaching. To her shock, she saw a young man from a neighboring village, walking directly toward her. He was smiling. He carried a hand drum, lightly tapping it as he approached. When he reached her hiding spot, he stopped playing and looked at her with kind eyes. "Why did you stop dancing?" he asked gently. "You looked so joyful and free while you danced." Adaugo was stunned. This stranger had followed her all the way here. More importantly, he could smell her. Yet he had still come. Adaugo's voice trembled as she spoke. You can smell me. And yet you still came looking for me? She couldn't believe it. Everyone back in my village teases me and laughs at me, she said bitterly. But the young man shook his head, his warm gaze never leaving hers. Don't worry about them, he said kindly. I think you're a wonderful dancer. He smiled. Please ignore their unkind words and keep dancing with happiness and freedom. Adaugo stared at him in disbelief. For the first time in her life, someone was speaking to her like she was normal, like she was worthy, like she mattered. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness but from comfort. She realized this man truly didn't care about her differences. For the first time in years she smiled. This stranger had given her hope. And so, she made a decision. She would ignore the cruel taunts of her neighbors. She would dance freely. She would no longer let her fears control her. And for the first time in her life she felt free. Adaugo sat in silence, staring at the young man before her. His presence was calming, his words kind, so unlike anything she had ever known. Who are you?" she asked softly. The young man smiled warmly, kneeling beside her. "I am Obidike," he said. "I play the drum at village festivals and celebrations." Adaugo blinked in surprise. "You're a drummer." Obidike nodded, patting his drum. "Music brings me joy. And tonight I saw you dancing." Adaugo's face fell. "You saw them laughing at me," she whispered. Obidike sighed, shaking his head. "I saw you dancing. That's all that mattered." Her eyes widened. No one had ever spoken to her this way. The villagers saw her as a burden, a princess with a curse. But Obidike spoke to her like she was just a girl, like she was normal. For the first time in her life, Adaugo didn't feel alone. As if sensing her thoughts, Obidike grinned and tapped his drum. "Shall I play for you again?" he asked. Adaugo hesitated. "Right here." Obidike shrugged playfully. "Why not? You danced beautifully before. Dance for yourself, not for them." His words touched something deep inside her. For years, Adaugo had hidden away, afraid of what people would say, how they would react. But here was someone who didn't care. Someone who saw her for who she was. Slowly she nodded. Obidike smiled and began to play, a steady, light rhythm. At first, Adaugo was unsure, shifting from foot to foot. But as the beat quickened, her body moved on its own. Her arms lifted, her feet twirled, and soon she was spinning under the moonlight. For the first time in years, Adaugo danced freely. And Obidike watched her with admiration. The next day, Adaugo found herself thinking about Obidike. And the day after that. And the day after that. Soon she found herself longing to see him again. One afternoon, she finally made up her mind. She snuck away from the palace, heart pounding, hoping he would be there. And he was. Standing beneath the same large tree, drum in hand, smiling as if he had been waiting for her all along. "Princess," he greeted, tapping his drum. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." Adaugo laughed lightly. "I wasn't sure I should." Obidike tilted his head. "And yet here you are." She bit her lip, shyly looking away. It was the first time she had spoken freely to a man without fear of rejection or mockery. That day they talked for hours. Obidike told her stories of his village, the songs he played at festivals, and how he loved watching people dance. In return, Adaugo opened up, something she had never done before. She spoke of her loneliness, her dreams of being loved, and the pain of being shunned by her own people. Obidike listened to every word, never once looking at her with pity or disgust. Instead, he smiled gently and said, "You are more than what others think of you." And for the first time in her life, Adaugo believed it. But not everyone was happy with Adaugo's new routine. One evening, as she sneaked back into the palace, she was unaware that someone had been watching her. Nkem, one of the palace maids, narrowed her eyes as she watched the princess return from the village. She had long gossiped about Adaugo, whispering cruel words about her odor and loneliness. And now the princess was sneaking away to meet a man, a common drummer. Nkem couldn't believe it. She rushed to the palace to spread the news. By the next morning, the whispers had begun. Auntie Chinyu and Auntie Onyai, two of the village gossipers, huddled together, whispering in hushed voices. "I heard the princess has been sneaking out," Auntie Chinyu said, eyes wide. "To meet a man." Auntie Onyai gasped. "A drummer, no less." They shook their heads in disapproval. "A princess has no business with a poor drummer," Nkem sneered, folding her arms. What would the king say if he found out? The gossip spread quickly, reaching the palace halls. And soon it reached Queen Purima. The queen's heart filled with worry. Her daughter had spent years isolated, and now she was sneaking away to meet a man, a drummer. Something had to be done. Unaware of the gossip, Adaugo continued meeting Obidike every afternoon. She had never been happier. Each day he played his drum and she danced. Each day they talked and laughed, their bond growing stronger. Until one fateful afternoon, when everything changed. Obidike took her hands, his gaze serious and full of emotion. "Adaugo," he said softly. Her breath caught. "I love you." The words hung in the air, stealing the wind from her lungs. Adaugo stared at him wide. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you dance," Obidike continued. "You are beautiful, kind, and full of life." "And he hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want to marry you." Adaugo's eyes filled with tears. No one had ever said these words to her before. No one had ever wanted her, not like this. Her entire life, she had dreamed of a man who would see beyond her flaw, who would love her for who she truly was. And now here he was. "Obidike," she whispered. He smiled hopefully, squeezing her hands. Adaugo let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I will marry you." Joy lit up Obidike's face. But just as they embraced, a sound shattered the moment. The distant cries of panic. Shouts from the village. Something was terribly wrong. Adaugo and Obidike turned toward the noise. And their newfound happiness was suddenly overshadowed by fear. Because something dark and deadly had arrived. The plague had come. The once lively village was now filled with panic and fear. People ran through the streets, shouting warnings. The plague had arrived. It came swiftly, like a shadow consuming everything in its path. Those who caught the sickness suffered a high fever, their bodies covered in blisters. Within days, they would collapse into violent fits, then fall deadly still. The fear of the infection spread faster than the disease itself. King Ezekiel and his royal council acted immediately, ordering a complete lockdown of the village. No one was allowed to enter or leave. Guards patrolled the borders, armed with spears, ensuring that no one disobeyed the orders. For Princess Adaugo, the timing could not have been worse. Her heart ached, not just for the people suffering but for Obidike. She had been so close to happiness, to a life filled with love and acceptance. But now, she had no way of knowing if Obidike was safe. For weeks, Adaugo stayed locked inside the palace, her once joyful days replaced by nights of fear and endless tears. The village streets were silent, except for the occasional wail of grief as families mourned their lost loved ones. The once beautiful land was now a prison of death. And then it happened. The curse becomes a blessing. One cold evening, Adaugo awoke burning with fever. Sweat poured down her face, her body aching from head to toe. Then she saw them, the red boils forming on her arms. Her heart pounded with terror. She knew what this meant. She had caught the plague. The palace was thrown into chaos. Queen Purima wept, refusing to leave her daughter's side. King Ezeku called for the royal physician, but no treatment worked. Day by day Adaugo grew weaker. Her once radiant skin became pale, her once graceful body unable to move. The royal physician shook his head. There is nothing more we can do. But Queen Purima refused to give up. In desperation, she summoned Mama Uju, the old village healer. Mama Uju arrived with a bag of herbs and ancient medicines, her wrinkled hands steady as she examined the dying princess. She mixed a thick, foul-smelling tonic from bitter roots, crushed leaves, and old animal blood. The queen hesitated. "Will this work?" she whispered. Mama Uju nodded grimly. "If the gods are willing." With trembling hands, Queen Purima spooned the disgusting mixture into Adaugo's mouth. For the first time in days, Adaugo stirred. Day passed, then another, and then a miracle. Her fever broke. Her body stopped shaking. Her skin began to heal. And when Adaugo finally opened her eyes, her mother burst into tears. She had survived. Days later, Adaugo stood before a full-length mirror, examining her reflection. Her body was weakened, her movements slow, but something felt different. She lifted an arm, took a cautious sniff, and gasped. The smell was gone. For the first time in her life, there was no foul odor surrounding her. She whirled around, sniffing her hands, her hair, her clothes, nothing. Tears of joy streamed down her face. The sickness that nearly killed her had somehow cured her of her curse. The years of suffering, the isolation, the shame, they were all gone. She was finally free. Months later, the plague finally passed, and the quarantine was lifted. Adaugo stepped out of the palace gates for the first time in a year. But this time things were different. People no longer turned away. There were no whispers, no gagging villagers, no mothers pulling their children aside. Instead, people stared in awe. The village men, once repulsed by her odor, now watched her with admiration. She walked with confidence, her head held high. She had dreamed of this moment her entire life. Acceptance, admiration, and respect. And yet, something felt wrong. Something was missing. As she made her way through the streets, she suddenly heard a familiar voice. Her heart stopped. She turned, and there he was, Obidike, her dear friend, her love, her betrothed. She had dreamed of this reunion, imagined herself running into his arms. But now, she hesitated. The village's eyes were on her. She was no longer the rejected, cursed princess. She was desired, respected, a noblewoman with high status. And Obidike, he was just a common drummer. Could she really be seen with him? Doubt crept into her mind. So instead of running to him, she lifted her chin and looked away. Obidike's smile faltered. He stepped forward, arms open, expecting the warm embrace they had longed for. But Adaugo took a step back. The pain in Obidike's eyes was immediate. "Adaugo," he said softly, confusion and hurt laced in his voice. But Adaugo forced herself to remain cold. "You will address me as Princess Adaugo," she said, her voice sharp and distant. Obidike flinched. She lifted her chin higher. "I no longer wish to continue our relationship." Silence. Then in a choked voice, Obidike whispered, But we love each other." Adaugo felt a sharp pain in her chest, but she ignored it. I deserve someone better than you, she said. Obidike's face twisted in heartbreak. She turned away, leaving him standing there, devastated. As she walked back toward the palace, she could hear his voice behind her. Adaugo, please, he begged. But she did not turn back. She was a princess now. She had everything she ever wanted. And yet, she had never felt emptier. The days that followed were filled with festivals, music, and noble visitors arriving to seek Princess Adaugo's hand in marriage. Now that her body odor was gone, she had become the most sought-after maiden in the kingdom. Among the many suitors were Prince Namdi, an arrogant nobleman, Lord Gozi, a charming but insincere lord, and Chief Udoka, an older wealthy man seeking a young bride. Adaugo bathed in the attention. Men who had once avoided her now competed for her favor. She laughed at their flattery, enjoyed their gifts, and spent her days wrapped in luxury. But at night, when she was alone in her chamber, her mind drifted back to Obidike. She buried those thoughts, telling herself that she had made the right choice. She was a princess. She needed a powerful husband, not a poor drummer. And so, when her father, King Ezeku, urged her to choose a suitor, she made a bold decision. I shall hold a wrestling tournament, she announced. The strongest man in the land shall win my hand in marriage. The king and noblemen cheered, a grand event to showcase her beauty and attract even greater warriors. But fate had other plans. As the tournament grew near, Adaugo became obsessed with her beauty. She spent hours before the mirror admiring herself, having her maids dress her in the finest silks. She stopped doing the small things that she was instructed to do, like simple baths several times every day. At first it was unnoticeable, but day by day something changed. Her maids whispered in hushed voices. Chinyere, her loyal maid, hesitated before brushing her hair. Even Queen Purima seemed to grow uneasy. And then, on the morning of the tournament, the truth revealed itself. Adaugo stepped into the royal arena, her gown shimmering in the sunlight. She lifted her delicate hand to wave at the cheering crowd. But the cheers faltered. A strange hush fell over the arena. And then, like a wave, the whispers spread. People wrinkled their noses. Men covered their faces. A few warriors coughed and turned away. And then one voice shattered the silence. The smell. It's back. A horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. Adaugo froze in place, her heart pounding. Her body odor had returned. The wrestlers who had once fought for her hand stepped away in disgust. Prince Namdi sneered, covering his nose. Lord Gozi shook his head, laughing under his breath. Chief Udoka whispered to his guards and left immediately. Even the villagers who once adored her now recoiled. Adaugo felt her entire world crumble. Tears burned in her humiliated eyes. She turned, ripping off her jewels, dropping them in the dirt. And then she ran. She ran past the palace gates, past the whispering villagers, past the mocking stares. She ran and ran until her lungs ached, until she reached the outskirts of the village. She collapsed onto the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Her pride had destroyed her. Her vanity had led her here. She had betrayed the only person who truly loved her. And now, she had nothing. As Adaugo wept, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up. Standing there, tall and steady, was Obidike, the only man who had ever loved her for who she truly was. She gasped, unable to believe he was still there. He should have hated her. He should have walked away. But he had not. Obidike stepped forward. His eyes filled with sadness and concern. "My dear one," he said softly, "why did you think so little of our love?" Adaugo shook her head, sobbing. "I was a fool, Obidike," she whispered. I thought that looking beautiful on the outside was more important than the love we shared. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I pushed you away, she admitted, her voice breaking. I chose vanity over you. And now I've lost everything. Obidike's eyes softened. You haven't lost everything, he said gently. Adaugo looked up at him, confused. Obidike smiled, stepping closer. You still have me. Her breath hitched. But why? She choked out. Why would you still love me after everything I've done? Obidike cupped her face, his warm hands steadying her shaking form. Because my love for you was never about your beauty, he said. It was never about what the village thought. It was you, your spirit, your kindness, your soul. Tears streamed down Adaugo's face. She had been so blind. She had chased admiration, thinking it would bring her happiness. But the only happiness she had ever known was standing right in front of her. With a soft, trembling voice, she whispered, Obidike, do you still want me? Obidike's smile widened. He wiped away her tears. I have always wanted you, he said. And with that, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed against his chest. It was the first true moment of peace she had felt in a long, long time.